Welcome to the deep dive. We sift through the technical stuff, the research, the insights you need, nice and quick. Today, we're really getting into the powerhouse of athletic performance. The glutes, specifically, we're looking at two really popular exercises, the barbell hip thrust, or HT, and the basic glute bridge, GB. And we got two main goals here. First, can doing these right before you compete actually give you a short-term speed boost? That's what scientists call post-activation performance enhancement, or PPE. And second, are these lifts actually essential for building the biggest possible glutes hypertrophy compared to, say, your classic squats and deadlifts?
Yeah, and it's important we get the terms right from the start. When we talk about that immediate boost, PPE is really the term we want, post-activation performance enhancement. It refers to a longer-lasting, measurable increase in your voluntary muscle force, the kind that actually makes you sprint faster.
Yeah.
It's different from the older idea, PPP, post-activation potentiation. That's more about a very short-term physiological twitch response, sort of at the muscle fiber level.
Yeah.
Coaches, athletes, they care about PPE because it's about the outcome.
Yeah.
Did doing that exercise beforehand actually make you perform better minutes later?
Right, the practical result. And the hip thrust and glute bridge are key here because of their mechanics, isn't that right?
Yeah.
They generate force mostly horizontally.
Exactly. And since sprinting and acceleration are all about pushing horizontally off the ground, these exercises seem, well, perfectly designed for that job, theoretically speaking.
Okay, so let's dive into that classic gym debate, the muscle activation wars. How does the barbell hip thrust actually stack up against, say, the good old back squat, electrically speaking?
Well, the EMG data, that's electromyography, measuring muscle excitation, it gives us a pretty clear picture. And for the main glute muscle, the gluteus maximus, or Gmax, the hip thrust is the clear winner. Studies comparing them found the hip thrust had significantly higher mean activation. And we're not talking a small difference here. Like in some studies, HT showed 69% to 87% mean EMG activity, the squat, only around 29% to 45%.
Wow, that's a huge gap.
It really is.
Huh.
And importantly, this wasn't just one part of the glute. It was higher activation in both the upper and lower sections of the Gmax.
So that really suggests, at least from an electrical signal standpoint, the squat isn't nearly as good at getting the glutes fired up compared to the hip thrust.
It does seem that way. And the benefit wasn't just for the glutes. The hip thrust also showed much greater mean activation of the biceps femoris. It's a key hamstring muscle. Around 41% mean activation versus only about 15% during the squat.
Okay, but why? The hamstrings are definitely working hard in a squat. Why do they seem to get shortchanged in terms of activation compared to the hip thrust?
They are working, absolutely. But it's a kind of mechanical tug-of-war. In a squat, you have to extend your hips and your knees at the same time. The hamstrings cross both joints. So when they contract hard to extend the hip, they're also kind of pulling against the knee extension that the quads are trying to do. They sort of become antagonistic to that knee extension moment. But the hip thrust, it involves very little knee movement. So the hamstrings can just focus almost purely on that powerful hip extension, leading to higher measured electrical activity.
Right, that makes sense. Simpler movement, more focused contraction. Okay, so HT beats the squat for Gmax and hamstrings activation. What about the deadlift, the other big posterior chain builder?
Interesting comparison. If you look just at the hamstrings, specifically the biceps femoris, the traditional straight part deadlift actually showed more activation than the hip thrust.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But, and this is key, if you shift focus back to the main driver, the gluteus maximus, the hip thrust still comes out ahead. Higher Gmax activation compared to both traditional deadlifts and hex bar deadlifts.
So the real takeaway isn't about one lift being universally better, but maybe that the hip thrust is super specialized for hitting the glutes hard, especially at that top, fully extended position.
Precisely. It maximizes activation when the hip is fully extended. And researchers have even mapped out the firing order during the hip thrust. It's pretty consistent. Gmax fires first, then the lower back stabilizes the erector spinae, then the hamstrings kick in, and finally the quads provide a bit of assistance.
Okay, that covers the underlying activation, but let's shift gears to that immediate performance jump PPE. Can you actually use a hip thrust or a glute bridge right before sprinting to get faster right now? You'll got some solid data from adolescent male soccer players, right? Experienced ones.
Yes, and that experience bit is important for PPE. This was a well-designed study. They compared the immediate PPE effects of the hip thrust and the glute bridge on sprint performance. And they tested two different loading schemes. A heavy load, 84% of their 1 rep max for 3 reps, and a more moderate load, 60% of 1 RM for 6 reps. There was also a control group that just rested.
And they rested for 7 minutes. That seems to be the standard window for this pay-PE effect to kick in before you test the sprint.
Exactly right, 7 minutes rest. Then they measured sprint times at 10, 20, and 30 meters. But they also looked at the horizontal force velocity profile components, which gives you a much deeper understanding of how the performance changed.
Okay, let's break that down. Force velocity profile. What are things like F-Morel, V0, and P-Maxrel telling us? Why should someone listening care about those?
Good question. They're super useful for coaches. FIREL is basically the maximum theoretical horizontal force you could produce relative to your body weight. Think of it as your pushing power right at the start. If FIREL goes up, you can accelerate harder initially.
Gotcha, starting power.
Right. Then V0 is your maximal theoretical speed, how fast you could theoretically run if there's no air resistance or anything slowing you down. Higher V0 means better top-end speed potential, and P-Maxrel. That's maximal power output, kind of the sweet spot where your force and velocity combine for the best effect.
Okay, makes sense. So what did the study find with these soccer players?
The results were pretty impressive. Both the hip thrust and the glute bridge protocols at both the heavy and moderate loads showed a moderate positive effect on that initial force, F0, the max power, P-Maxrel, and crucially, on the 10-meter acceleration sprint time.
How much faster did they get in that first 10 meters?
The time reduction was significant. It ranged from about -2.5% up to nearly -3% faster across the different protocols.
Wow, almost 3% faster in just 10 meters, just from doing a few reps 7 minutes earlier. That's huge in sports. What surprised me, though, is the glute bridge doing so well. I kind of thought of it as the hip thrust's less intense little brother.
That's probably the most practical takeaway for coaches here. It really did hold its own. When they directly compared the heavy glute bridge protocol, 84% 1RM, to the heavy hip thrust protocol, the glute bridge still produced small but statistically significant positive effects on V0, that theoretical max speed, and on the 10-meter sprint time.
So that's really useful, right? If an athlete doesn't have access to a barbell setup or maybe has some back issues making heavy barbell hip thrusts tricky, the glute bridge could still be a really solid option to get that immediate acceleration boost.
Precisely. It seems to be a viable alternative for priming that PPE effect, especially for acceleration performance like you see needed in soccer. And the study overall supports the idea that those moderate to heavy loads, that 60% to 84% range, work well for PPE in athletes who already have decent training experience, say 2 years or more.
Okay, so we've got the short-term speed boost covered. Let's switch to the long game. Building muscle size, hypertrophy. If your main goal is maximum glute development, does actually adding the hip thrust to your routine on top of things like leg presses or deadlifts make a real difference over time?
Yeah, this is where a specific 10-week hypertrophy study on untrained young women gives us some great insight. They basically split them into 2 groups. Group 1 did a pretty standard lower body routine, 45-degree leg press, and stiff leg deadlifts, both solid glute builders. Group 2 did the exact same exercises, leg press and stiff leg deadlifts, but they also added the barbell hip thrust. Let's call them the LS group and the LS BHT group.
Right. Now, my first thought is, well, group 2 just did more work, more total volume. So, of course, they grew more, didn't they? Was it just the extra volume, or was the type of exercise, the hip thrust itself, the key?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And yeah, both groups definitely saw significant increases in glute muscle thickness. The leg press and stiff leg deadlift alone group, LS, got about a 6.0% increase. Pretty good.
Pretty decent gains.
But the group that added the barbell hip thrust, LS BHT, they saw a clearly superior increase, plus 9.3%. So adding the hip thrust provided a benefit that went beyond just, doing one extra exercise. The specific stimulus mattered.
Okay, so why? What's the mechanism? Why is that combination so much better for building size?
It really boils down to how muscles work, specifically the length-tension relationship, and where each exercise creates the most force. Think about the leg press or the stiff leg deadlift. They tend to challenge the glutes most when the muscle is stretched out at longer muscle lengths.
So like at the bottom of the movement when your hip is really flexed?
Exactly. That's where the peak forces often occur in those traditional lifts when the muscle is under stretch. Now, the barbell hip thrust, it's the opposite. It creates massive force when the gluteus maximus is at its shortest length right at the top, when you lock out your hips in full extension.
Ah, so it's hitting the muscle hardest in the contracted position, while the others hit it hardest in the stretched position.
Precisely. And that's the key insight for hypertrophy. If you only do exercises that load the muscle heavily when it's stretched, you might be missing out on a really potent stimulus in that fully contracted short-length position.
So you're not training the muscle effectively through its entire range of contraction under heavy load.
It's exactly. By combining both types exercises that stress the long lengths, like your squats, deadlifts, leg presses, and exercises that stress the short length, like the hip thrust, you create a much more complete, comprehensive stimulus. You're hitting the glutes hard across their full working range, and that holistic approach seems to drive superior muscle growth. So let's pull this all together. If your goal is immediate PPE effects boosting horizontal force for better acceleration, then both the hip thrust and, interestingly, the glute bridge are effective tools, especially using those moderate to heavy loads we talked about.
Right.
But if your goal is maximum long-term glute size, the evidence suggests combining exercises is key. You want lifts that challenge the glutes when they're stretched and lifts that challenge them when they're fully contracted, like the hip thrust. That combination seems to yield the best hypertrophy results.
Okay, that makes sense. But here's something that still seems a bit muddy, especially for coaches thinking long term. We see these great acute PPE effects, but when you look at studies training athletes with hip thrusts for, say, 6 or 8 weeks, some show sprint improvements, but others show, well, basically nothing significant happens to their speed. How do we square that?
That's a really important point. And the answer probably lies in how the hip thrust was programmed in those longer studies. What was the main goal? Was it pure strength or was it power and speed? If a study primarily used really heavy loads, like close to their 1 RM, for those 8 weeks, they're maximizing strength gains. That's great for the force end of the force velocity curve.
But sprinting isn't just about maximum force.
Exactly. Sprinting is fast. It lives more on the power and velocity end of that curve. So the current thinking is, if you want the strength gains from hip thrust to actually transfer effectively to a high-speed activity like sprinting over the long term, you probably need to train it using more submaximal loads.
Like that 60% to 80% range again.
Yeah, focusing on moving the weight fast, optimizing power output, and how quickly you can generate force, not just grinding out the heaviest possible weight. So maybe the studies that didn't see sprint improvements used protocols that were too heavy, too focused on strength, and didn't translate well to speed.
That makes sense. Match the training stimulus to the desired outcome. Speed requires training for speed and power, not just brute strength.
Precisely. And that's why those acute PPE findings using the force velocity profile are so useful. A coach can actually measure if an athlete is more force deficient or velocity deficient, and then use exercises like the hip thrust or glute bridge loaded appropriately to target that specific weakness. It allows for much more individualized programming.
So the big practical takeaway here seems to be, variety isn't just for fun. For your glutes, whether you're chasing speed or size, you really need to challenge them effectively through their entire range, fully stretched and fully contracted.
Couldn't have said it better. And that brings us to a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. We've seen evidence that different exercises are better at different points. Hip thrusts may be best at short lengths, deep squats, or leg presses, perhaps better at longer lengths. So take a look at your own training right now. Are you hitting both ends of that spectrum? Are you maybe doing lots of deep squats but neglecting that powerful lockout contraction? Or are you all about hip thrust but maybe missing the stimulus from a deep stretch under load? Think about whether your plan truly covers the entire force length curve for your glutes to maximize your strength, your speed, and your size.